The world has never changed faster and will never change slower. Welcome to the We Are Future series, where we get to talk to global thought leaders and industry experts on all things digital, technology and innovation, and how it impacts the way we live, work, act and interact. Now tune in for those candid conversations and be part of creating the future of work. Okay, well, let's get straight into it. We're super excited to be joined by Stowe from the US, who has been in the future of workspace for quite some time. And we want to talk to Stowe all about where the changes have been in the last few years, but also how we can prepare for what's to come. So thank you so much for joining us, Stowe. I would love to introduce yourself to our audience. Who are you? What are you doing? And how did you get to where you're now?
Well, I guess the first thing to say, I've been doing it for a while, and started to, I guess I would say I started to have the future of work as my sort of central obsession about 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. But before that, I had sort of come at it from the technology side. So I was working originally as a technologist myself, a developer, designer, but increasingly, that became consulting with large companies who were trying to build work technologies of some kind. And so I've been very close to the forefront of what those companies are up to. For example, I coined the term hashtag in 2007, which was not a term that was invented by Twitter. It was invented by Chris Messina and me. Along the way, I've done a lot of writing and a lot of research and done a lot of consulting, both with the large technology vendors, but also as well, major management consulting firms, major media companies who are wondering about these issues and trying to make sense of it. Uh-huh. So I write a newsletter, the Work Futures Daily, which comes out daily. It's free. You can find it very easily on Medium. It's easy to find. And I'm also a contributing editor to various other publications like Gig Ohms, Medium publication, for example.
Excellent. And, you said you've been in that future space for the last 10 years. Where have you seen the biggest changes, probably in the last only 3 to 4 years?
Well, there's been some really significant changes, and to some extent these may be more limited to the United States, mm-hmm. but some of these are universals. One is the tightening labor market has led to the adoption of a set of practices in business that is now being called employee experience. And what that basically means is companies are shifting their attention, basically taking the same kind of thinking that they use for customer experience and applying it internally to help employees better understand what the company's about, mm-hmm. What its direction is, what it's supposed to stand for, and to create a higher degree of employee engagement. Now, some of that is about productivity and performance, but increasingly it's really companies really trying to get at what makes their people tick and what in fact might be making them unhappy in the workplace, and to try to make sure those trends are pushed in a positive direction to the degree that's possible. So that includes a whole bunch of new, more worker-friendly policies like shortening the work week, remote work, paid maternity and paternity leave. Of course, that's very singular to the United States because we don't have actual federal laws about that. And simple things like relaxed dress codes, for example. And so the paradoxical thing about that is that it's happening in the shadow of growing automation in the workforce, which is, you'd think, leading to less people being employed. But at the same time, there is right now, because automation really hasn't fully hit, we're in this very tight labor market. And so companies have to do more to keep scarce talent happy. Another major thread that, sort of dominates the discussion of what's going on is what I call the shift to the horizontal business away from the vertical business, which is moving away from top-down hierarchical management to more hierarchical models, which is you might have all kinds of structures in your business, based on what works best right now in this part of the business, in this particular department or whatever. But basically, the fundamental notion is that industrial era economic principles are becoming more and more questionable. That's partly due to this growing, I would consider it growing unease about the destructive powers of unfettered markets, right? Mm-hmm. And also a discrediting of the equilibrium-based economic models of the previous century. And in fact, I just wrote a long thing about that called Welcome to the Econolypse, suggesting that we're going through a period of time where the economic principles of how we perceive and think about the world themselves are undergoing a revolution, and therefore, big surprise, it means almost everything else is going to be impacted by that. And of course, we have, the failures of the neoliberal era, rampant inequality, global climate change, the dismantling of the social safety net. All of those things basically adds up to an argument that business cannot continue on as it has. And of course, who are giving advice to corporations and individuals, we have to tell them they have to accept this brave new world and not look away. We have to accept these, sort of revolutionary grumblings and tectonic shifts that are going on. And the last element about that, which is really important, is the rise of a new economy that has just blossomed or mushroomed, I guess might be a better way of looking at it, driven by the rise of platform ecosystems. Amazon, Airbnb, Rent the Runway, Alibaba, goes on and on, Uber. And those invalidate the notion of companies as self-contained entities and open the door to the horizontal assemblages of ecosystem participants with very different forms of governance. And of course, it's largely unregulated right now, and it's kind of a mess, huge chaos. Uber's losing hundreds of billions of dollars or whatever. But meanwhile, there's some great examples where it isn't so VC fueled and it's a little more interesting. I use Rent the Runway as one of my favorite examples, which is a platform on which now that company and its partners can help, particularly women, but increasingly men as well, rent clothes instead of owning them. And it's kind of a fascinating example of a platform that's growing really quickly, but is not losing billions of dollars. So there's all of these things happening at the same time, and that's one of the things that makes it so confusing for people. Is it's very difficult to take one of these threads, examine it independently of all the others, and so you have to help people get a sort of systematic and systemic view of all of these things and how they mutually influence each other. Mm-hmm. And then when you get particular down at the micro level, a particular company, a particular group of people, a particular country, you have to, take into effect all of those macro effects in order to make sense of it.
And can you give us a little bit of a snapshot as to how companies can get this very holistic point of view and bringing all those elements together and prepare for what's next? Or even as an individual, how can we take all those different assets and facets, what's impacting our careers and our lives, into consideration to prepare for that?
Well, I have a saying, which I've said many times, in a connected world, the most important choice you have is who to follow. So people have to decide who they're going to listen to. And so you have to find a community, a collection of people that are pushing at these ideas and, can help you make sense of it. And it's one of those things where it may take a period of exposure, not, one day, not reading one pamphlet, one blog post, going to one conference or something. But there is a collection of people that I could, call out who I think are immensely important if you're trying to make sense of this world. But it's a relatively long list. I'd say 24 or so people that I think are relatively knowledgeable and have written widely about this and published, insightful. In other words, they're the people that are asking the right questions and attempting to make sense of this stuff. But they share the common view that it's a big ball of wax. Everything's tied to everything else. So you're not going to have me point at some listicle and say, "Oh, read this one article about the 7 things you need to, prepare yourself." Although I did once write an article that's very popular called 10 Work Skills for the Post-Normal Era, which has gotten a lot of play. And I intentionally did it as 10 because I was responding to an article that was written by the World Economic Forum, which I thought was incredibly bad. And it had, 10 things in it saying, these are the skills of the future. And I said, oh, that's awful. That's like the worst list I've seen. And so I actually went against my own sort of, my own orientation. I wrote a listicle. Here's the 10 things. So I recommend that anyone interested in that particular question of what skills do you need for the future should look at 10 work skills for the post-normal era.
Yeah, we'll definitely put the link in this. And I guess this is also what reflects so many people's attitude. They want to see the one thing that they can do, or the 3 steps to become successful, or the 5 things to read, to whatever it might be. It's following this process, this protocol that somebody else is giving you because it's easier to follow. But how can, and obviously we don't know what's tomorrow and everything is changing so fast now. How can we be more proactive and actually prepare? What are those skills? Maybe you can give a couple of examples from those 10 you've listed.
Sure, I'll give you a couple. I have it right here in front of me, actually, because I had put it together for your question. The first is boundless curiosity.
I loved it.
The most creative people are insatiably curious. They want to know what works and why. So it turns out, however, most people think of curiosity as one of those sort of inbuilt things. You're born curious or not. But it turns out curiosity comes along with a set of skills that can be learned. So you can actually become more curious by doing certain things. It's one of those examples where you change your behavior and actually your mind follows. So that's a very important one. Another that I think is really critical, and I've written a lot about recently, emergent leadership. So the ability to steer things in the right direction without the authority to do so through social competence. And so we are now actually having a number of companies that have reorganized themselves, and in some cases it took decades to get there, in which they're organized around the principles of emergent leadership. So they have a culture in which people step forward and take responsibility to do something because it's necessary and they have the right skills and the backing of other people. And then after that project or initiative or whatever, they step back into whatever they were doing before. It's, management is not like a profession. It's a necessary evil, and we should only do as much of it as necessary and no more.
Yeah.
I think I'm quoting I think that's, I'll look it up. I think it's Drucker.
These two examples are perfect examples for showing that it all comes down to being proactive about it. You can't rely on somebody else to give you the path, because then your destiny is in their hands and not in your own.
You can't even depend on yourself. So one of the others in this list is constructive uncertainty, which is the active practice of avoiding making a decision until the last possible minute, because that if once you get to the point where you're saying it's time to make decisions, then you start to decrease your field of focus. You start to narrow all options. You start to say, well, let's reject the things that are crazy or harebrained or dangerous or whatever. But constructive uncertainty is it's accepting the fact that we're biased, right? And biases are built into our brains as deeply as lust and language. So we can't get away from our biases. We have to, as a result, we have to learn to operate knowing that we're biased, and therefore take actions that decrease the likelihood of our biases taking charge of things. And then the last one, I think, is, well, there's a whole bunch. Post-normal creativity, there's a whole long list, but the 10th one is the most important ultimately, and it has to be 10th, because sense making is putting together all the skills you need to create unique insights related to decision making. And of course, that's ultimately the rubber makes the road, where the rubber meets the road. So that's quite a complicated ball of wax, but I explain my take on these things in that article. It would be a good starting point for a lot of people who might not have heard a list of this sort, because I'm not saying things like get STEM training or learn to program or
I just want
understand
to say
AI. It's not a list like that at all.
Yeah, and I think that this is so important to mention, that it all comes down to those soft skills, because in the end these are the transferable skills that we can apply in any industry, in any technical area. And if you've got the curiosity to learn and stay on top of the game, and also challenge your thinking of how you do certain things and could that be automated, you could be just more proactive about it. So I think, this is a really good list, and I can't wait to dig deeper in it. Would you also give the same recommendations to companies, how they can prepare for the future of work?
When they think about the skills they should be looking for example, when they hire people. In fact, emergent leadership is, I think, number 2 at Google now. For technical people, they look for technical ability. And then after that, they look for the ability to be an emergent leader. So you'll see that a lot of the, sort of companies that have gone the farthest down this path, that are most mature in this direction, they will have internalized a lot of that. So WL Gore Company, for example, the people who make Gore-Tex, they've been doing this for decades, actually. They will internalize those things and look for those skills and help, maybe even help train the people at that. The thing that I'm really seeing, though, that's most heartening is that some organizations are moving to a new form of organizational form, structure, behavior, and I call that the emergent organization. So that's based on the core notion of emergent leadership, but it's also based on the notion of sort of a 3-tier model. I wrote about this in this on emergent leadership, on the emergent organization recently. And so what you're seeing is there's sort of 3 domains where you have, at the front line of the company, you'll have very entrepreneurial leadership, where people are highly engaged in a close dance with their customer base or their partners in an ecosystem or whatever, and they're trying to innovate very rapidly to get better products to market and so on. And then there's a sort of intermediary tier that's there to support the efforts of the entrepreneurial leadership. They're sort of the enabling layer of, and they may not have a direct reporting relationship with the people who are, the entrepreneurial layer. They're more interested in making sure that, people have the resources they need in order to do things. And they will get groups of people together across entrepreneurial groups to come up with shared resources, like building a technology platform that all can benefit from, and so on. And then there's the top level, which is the sort of architectural level of organization. This is like what we would consider the senior people who run a business, and they're trying to look at the wide world and, set direction and, garden the culture so that the company's capable of accomplishing what its broad strategic goals might be. And they, in turn, may not have direct relationships with these other people in a managerial sense. They're not telling them what to do, or, they're, making sure that the company has the resources available to invest appropriately in R&D and what new initiatives should be kicked off that will, exist so that new entrepreneurial managers will show up and run with them and so on. So I think that model is really fascinating. In fact, my friend Simone Cicero, who's at the Platform Design Toolkit group, Boundaryless, he and I have been writing about that quite a lot recently, and it's all very interesting stuff. So I would recommend people take a look at it, and it's sort of an outgrowth, or runs in parallel with this notion of platform ecosystems, because it seems like that's one of the places where we're seeing some of that take place. But it's also happening in, if you will, more conventional, less not platform-based at all, like Gore-Tex. Gore has a whole bunch of partnerships with people, but they're more, if you will, supply chain type organization, kind of structured. So it can happen even in something that seems more like a conventional, Gore is doing very high-tech stuff. They're doing very advanced materials design and so on. But it's not, something like an Uber. It doesn't feel like that. It's not a Silicon Valley kind of company. So you see it all over the place. It's just there's only probably, 6 dozen good examples out there. It's very early days. But there's a lot of people that are experimenting and trying to, craft their culture in that way.
And you're certainly one of them. So what is the best way to stay in touch with you, learn more about what you do, follow your journey? What's the best way for us to connect with you?
Well, Work Futures Daily, my newsletter. My website is workfutures.org, but that's really just sort of the, it's my corporate website. It's not as interesting. So medium.com/work-futures is a good place to go. There's lots of chewy, chocolatey goodness there.
Excellent. Well, we'll link all those resources in the notes. And I'm looking forward to staying in touch with you and learning more about how to create the future of work with you.
Yeah, great.
Thanks you so much. Thank you. And that wraps up another insightful conversation about the future of work. And now we want to hear from you. What was the biggest takeaway from this conversation? Make sure you share your learnings on LinkedIn and also tag our guest speakers. And of course, if you or somebody you know has some more interesting take on the future of work, send us an email to contact@wearefuture.com. Until next time, and keep creating the future of work.